Okay, so let's finish up with Kant tonight, um, or today, whenever you're watching this. Okay, so thus far, so far, we have discussed the pure intuitions and the idea that Kant is trying to prove that metaphysics is possible by trying to find synthetic a priori judgments and the entire scheme he laid out. All right, so those are the previous two lectures I did. Now we get to kind of the key argument. All of that was kind of preliminary. That was meant to build up to this moment. We've got to the moment where he's going to finally prove that metaphysics is possible. How is he going to do that? Well, it all revolves around what Kant terms the concepts of the understanding. And he characterizes the concept of the understanding as a priori laws of nature, which are universal laws. He says, if nature meant things in themselves, then it couldn't be known. But we know that there are a priori laws of nature. How do we know there are these things that are a priori laws of nature? Well, because of the conditions for the possibility of experience. So back to that once more. Given the way that we experience the world, we can go back through the veil of representation. We can go back through that veil and find out what is going on in our consciousness in general that makes it possible for us to have experiences at all, any kind of experience. All right. Now, central to this argument is that he believes that these are all technical terms, even though not completely divorced from their real meanings, but these are technical terms. Kant says not all empirical judgments are judgments of experience. Some are judgments of perception. So he divides empirical judgments into two types. There are judgments of perception, and there are judgments of experience. And the biggest difference between the two is, or the key difference between the two is that judgments of perception are entirely subjective versus judgments of experience, which he calls universally subjective. Oops, subjective, not subject. Typo there. Universally subjective, but it's the same. That means it's true for everybody, you know, so I don't know why he doesn't just call that objective. Universally subjective means objective. There's this distinction between these two is entirely subjective versus objective. Okay, now they're both experience. Empirical means experience. So let me try to spell out this with some examples, perhaps. Entirely subjective judgments of perception. Some things are certainly that way, just maybe going to stay that way. Like, do you prefer chocolate or vanilla? Some people like vanilla better than chocolate. Some people like chocolate better than vanilla. It's subjective, you know, that's just a matter of personal preference and how you experience those flavors. However, also based on experience, what day is it? Well, that's not entirely subjective because today is whatever day you're listening to this. It is that day. Okay, it is that time and it is that day. And that's not your personal judgment. I mean, it's not personal subjective thing. For everybody in the, well, immediate region, it is that time and it is that day. That's a judgment of experience. It's objective. It's not subjective. Now, here's the thing about the concepts of the understanding. They are what Kant believes carries us from the one to the other. So we start with judgments of perception, and we apply the concepts of the understanding, and they take us to an objective judgment that's true for everybody. All right, here's how I'm going to try to describe how this happens with this example. What is the temperature of the room you're in right now? Is it hot? Is it cold? Maybe it's just right. That's a judgment of perception. I mean, it's entirely subjective. How the room feels to you right now is entirely subjective. Now go get a thermometer and look at what the temperature of the room is on the thermometer, assuming it's working. Well, if it says it's 72 degrees, for instance, whatever it says, that's not a subjective judgment. That's an objective judgment about the temperature of the room, whether you're hot or cold or medium or whatever. Hey, it's 72 degrees. Okay, how did we get from the one to the other? Now, this is Kant says this all depends upon these things he calls the concepts of the understanding, which connect our media experiences, our perceptions, with consciousness in general. And using these, by the way, he also calls these categories, and you'll find a list of categories in the text. Those are pretty much the same thing as concepts of the understanding. Again, Kant with his having more than one name for everything. But if you look at the categories, those line up with the concepts of the understanding. I want to focus on one of them in particular. Might be the most important one anyways, but it certainly is for our purposes because Kant is responding to Hume, and so the concept of cause and effect, it's on that list. It is a concept of the understanding. There are others, okay, so don't get me wrong here. He's got a list. You can see it in the reading. But let's just pay attention to cause and effect, because that's one in particular that we can kind of use to wrap our minds around what Kant's doing here. Like, for instance, the temperature of the room. You feel hot, you feel cold, whatever, it's 72 degrees. How do we determine that it's 72 degrees? You look at the thermometer. How does the thermometer determine? How does the thermometer decide that it's 72 degrees? Well, it doesn't decide, right? It's a cause and effect relationship. I don't know how the new school digital ones work, but if you go to the old school, like it's mercury in a tube with numbers, and as it gets warmer, the mercury heats up and expands, and as it gets cooler, the mercury cools down and contracts. So it's all, and that is all cause and effect, right? So you apply these cause and effect relationships, that gets you to the objective judgment. And therefore to a judgment of experience rather than a judgment of perception. By the way, the same applies to the time of day, the day and the time of day. It's all measured by, it has to do with how fast the earth is spinning and its position relative to the sun and all that stuff. All that is cause and effect as well. So the objective time is also measured by using cause and effect, causation again. And so when we use this concept of cause and effect and apply it to our experiences, we get objective judgments, which are judgments of experience. Now, couple of things to note at this point. One thing is, this is really very much empirical in a lot of ways, but the concept of the understanding are a little bit maybe on the rationalist side of the equation, which makes Kant less of a pure empiricist than, say, Hume or Locke. But notice, by the way, that Hume and Locke didn't really do much to explain this kind of phenomena. I mean, this kind of thing happening, because clearly we do have objective judgments about our experiences, which we share with others. Time, temperature, color. What color is something, which generally we do share, not always. I mean, you might be colorblind or something, but generally we have a lot of things that we experience, and we experience them the same as others. And we can objectively say that's blue, it's 5 o'clock, whatever. Okay. So and Kant's kind of relying on that notion that we have these objective experiences for this argument, because in a way it sort of works backwards. How do we have, in other words, he's not proving that we have the objective experiences. We have them. Why do we have them, and how do we have them? Kant is offering us an explanation for why that occurs and how that occurs. And the explanation he uses is these concepts of, or concepts of the understanding, cause and effect in particular being one of them. We apply those to our subjective experiences. We then get objective truths, which are judgments of experience. Now, how does this relate to our argument that we're working our way through? Well, because the concepts of the understanding belong right there next to the pure intuitions, okay? In other words, they are synthetic and a priori. They are synthetic and they are a priori, and they are essentially built into our consciousness. Let me see if I can, sorry, I'm all right, so I'm going back to the previous lecture, and notice the one modification I made here is that you add, under consciousness in general, concepts of the understanding. This is, again, built into our consciousness, and these concepts are synthetic and a priori as well, and therefore, sorry, maybe I'll go back to this one now. Oops, not the right one. And therefore, they fit under the question. Are synthetic a priori judgments possible? Kant says yes, because of math and geometry, but that doesn't prove metaphysics, because as he stipulated earlier, as it says on here, it's not math, and it can't be math, so it's not that. That doesn't answer the question. But guess what? There's something besides math and geometry that's synthetic and a priori, namely the concepts of the understanding, okay? Okay, so what is Kant trying to prove with all this? You know, what is the whole point of any of it? Actually, Kant applies this method that he's come up with to a lot of philosophical problems. The infinity of time and space, in other words, whether it's infinite or not. For instance, that's one. I'll focus on a few that I think Kant actually thinks are very important. So not just my personal opinion here. I think Kant actually thinks of these as being sort of central to central issues that he's addressed, namely God and the soul. Okay, so the religious aspect. Kant was religious. He was a Christian. It's pretty clear. But he didn't think that he could prove God's existence. He did make a moral argument for the existence of God, but it wasn't meant to be a flat out proof of his existence like Descartes was trying to offer. He actually says that he wants to show the limits of human understanding to make room for faith. And therefore, in other words, faith in God, or faith in general, I guess. Because look, if there's this entire things in themselves, noumena realm of, there's a whole bunch of things that human beings can't experience. Why can't we experience them? Because they don't fit the conditions for the possibility of experience. Certain conditions must be met for it to be possible for us to experience things. For instance, in order for us to experience something, it has to be at a place and at a time, right? That's the pure intuitions. Well, God, you can't put God at a certain place and time. At least in the traditional conception of God, you can't do that. So God cannot be experienced. Doesn't mean he doesn't exist. He just exists out there in the noumenal realm where of things we just can't experience. Apparently there's a lot we can't experience. The soul, that too could be argued in the same way, because consciousness in general is on the other side of the veil of representation. That is yourself, your I. What are the characteristics of your soul? We don't know that. It's on the noumenal side of the veil of representation scheme. Perhaps I should put that up instead of what I have here. So yeah, the noumena we can't understand. God could be there. The soul could be there. Consciousness in general is on that side of the veil of representation. All right, and finally, free will. The question of free will, been around since ancient times. How does he address this question? Are our decisions and actions determined? That is to say, determined by fate, you could say that. Well, in more modern terms, and in the way that Kant would be thinking about this, I mean, he's modern enough. Causal connections. It's absolutely plausible, and a whole bunch of people argue that given your physiology and your social conditioning, in other words, all these causal factors that determine you don't really make decisions. Your decisions they're causally determined. They're determined by your brain chemistry, add your social interactions, whatever. It's all causal. You think you're making free decisions about this or that, but actually you're determined to make those those decisions by the causal connections and causality. I mean, you really did not have a choice. Free will is an illusion. All right, so that's the context in which he addresses this question of free will. Kant's got a kind of a interesting solution to this problem, because Kant says that the empirical world down here, okay, the empirical world is completely, absolutely governed by cause and effect relationships. Objectively and necessarily, okay, by the way, that also answers Hume, because remember, Hume said that causation is completely subjective. Kant disagrees wholeheartedly with that, and this is his alternative, because in the empirical world, everything is causally related everything else. Everything is cause and effect. But fortunately for us, in terms of free will, that is, if you want to have free will, we are not in the empirical world because, well, our bodies are, but our consciousness is not, because consciousness exists on the other side of the veil of representation, and therefore our consciousness does not necessarily need to be governed by cause and effect relationships. And so cause and effect does not apply to our consciousness, and therefore our consciousness can be free and we can make free decisions. This is Kant's kind of pretty interesting, by the way, answer to this question of free will versus determinism. Yes, the world is determined by cause and effect. The empirical world, the world of our experience, fortunately for us, we're not in it. So we can have free will as well. Okay. I'd kind of like to, I wished I could talk about some of the objections to Kant, because Kant is a very popular guy. I mean, a good number of my professors were Kantian. The very first professor I ever had was a Kantian. I've had a lot of Kantian. He's a popular character. And so I'd like to kind of point out some of the things I think are flaws in his theory. I'll just mention them instead of trying to explain them. Modern physics actually kind of really is at odds with Kant's notion of mathematics and geometry, which, by the way, does not really blow Kant out of the water or anything, because, you know, you could actually get rid of, that was only a step towards the argument he was trying to make. So conceivably, you can just get rid of that part of it and still, as long as you have concepts of the understanding, which is the key thing, then you can still remain a Kantian, even, and by the way, a lot of Kantians do this. They said, okay, he was wrong about space and time. All right, but I still agree with his theory. All right, because modern physics, space-time, they're the same thing. He was assuming Euclidean geometry, which is not true. All right, if you want to maybe look that up on your own time, maybe, sorry. I disagree. Actually, I disagree with his central concept about concepts of the understanding being built into consciousness and being synthetic and a priori. And the way he characterizes them as rules, which he does. But maybe I'll mention that when I talk about Wittgenstein and my point of view. You know, you don't have to accept my opinion on this or my point of view on this. I won't say it's an opinion, but because there's a lot of Kantians around that like this general notion, modified in various ways. There's a whole bunch of different flavors, maybe, of Kantianism. I should also note that not everybody who's a Kantian is just a Kantian. You know, there's Hegelians. Hegel is kind of draws a lot from Kant. Schopenhauer definitely is very much a Kantian. Anti-realists, I know, a crazy term, but also Kantian. All right, so there's a lot of Kantians running around the world, at least philosophers. I guess not regular people, but you know, philosophers. A lot of Kantians running around. Like I said, he's a very important figure and a very influential figure. I hope that I've explained this well enough that you can at least grasp the basics. All right, thank you.